That's 12 noon, everyone. Thanks for joining us here for Iowa's largest and tallest trees. We're joined by Mark Rao, Iowa's big tree expert. And so we're going to have a fascinating ride here for the next hour or so. So we have this in a format where we've recorded the presentation so that we get everything worked out and all the kinks worked out, and it'll be nice and smooth. And then Mark's going to join us here at the end for a little question and answer session. But before we jump into it, Mark, welcome. Thanks for joining us here today.
Well, thank you. Glad to be here.
Welcome, everyone, to Iowa's largest and tallest trees. My name is Mark Rao. I'm from Iowa. I grew up in Des Moines in the Union Park, Grandview College neighborhood. And when I was younger, there were still lots of big elm trees around, so there were plenty of trees to be inspired by. And I even had a big elm tree right in my own yard, which I climbed all the time, which was amazing. So that was my first experience of admiring a big tree. I would go so far as to say that I loved that tree. And I would climb up there and I could see downtown. On a windy day, I had a nice ride. And in the spring when the warblers were migrating, I could be up in that tree and I could be within 3 or 4 feet of amazing warblers like magnolia warblers and chestnut-sided warblers and many other species. So it was great. But all things change, and of course Dutch elm disease came along and I lost that tree. But I was always impressed by big trees, and I used to go down along the river and I would see big cottonwoods that were 16 feet around and they seemed huge to me, so I was impressed by that. And we're going to be seeing pictures and hearing a little bit of information about some of these trees as we go along, including this one here that's our cover slide. This is a large swamp white oak, and I've got an interesting little story that goes along with this tree. So let's continue. So the Big Tree Program started in 1940. Joseph Stearns, who was a forester, was alarmed at seeing the loss of so many of our country's biggest trees. So his quote, "Let every tree lover, every forester, every lumberman rally to fight for the preservation of our biggest tree specimens." That quote appeared in American Forests magazine. And that was the first call out to the public to find the largest trees in the country. And that was the start of the National Big Tree Program. Now here in Iowa, our program didn't start until 1978. But I started measuring trees in about 1972. And it wasn't long after that, I saw a magazine in the library, and it was the American Forest magazine, and it had the national listing of the largest trees in the country. And I found it fascinating, and I scoured over that list, and I decided I would try and see what big trees I could find in my local neighborhood. So that's how I got started. So when you're going to decide which is the biggest tree, you've got to have some kind of a system to determine that. So the American Forestry Association, which is now just called American Forests, came up with this criteria. And so it includes the trunk circumference and the height and the average crown spread. Every inch of the circumference equals a point, and every foot of height equals a point. And the crown spread doesn't count for as much because each foot is only worth 1/4 of a point. So you add all those points together, and that way you can compare trees of similar size to see which one is the largest. And if there are 2 trees or even more that are within 5 points of each other, then they are considered co-champions. So people are often curious as to how you measure a tree. And while I'm thinking of it, I'd like to point out that unless you're climbing the tree and doing a tape drop, you're not actually measuring the tree. So all measurements from the ground are actually estimates of the height. But with the right equipment, they can be very precise. So there's the stick method, the yardstick method, triangulation, which uses a clinometer and a tape measure, and the sign plus sign method. So the first couple of methods are just going to be rough estimates, and then the triangulation method can be accurate if it's done properly, and then the sign plus sign method is the most accurate method. So with the stick method, I'm not going to read through every thing on this particular slide. You can go online and find explanations and information about how to measure the height of trees. But basically the stick method, what you're going to do, as this illustration shows, is you're going to determine in miniature the height of that tree on a ruler or a stick with your arm extended, and then you're going to put that stick horizontal, and then you have somebody stand out there at that distance, and then you measure to the trunk, and that's going to be approximately the same distance as the height of the tree. So triangulation. This is the method that I used for most of my time measuring trees, and I figured out early on that most people were doing it wrong. So the problem is, what people typically do is they have an instrument like a clinometer or a hypsometer, which is designed to give them a reading of the height at a certain distance away from the tree. So what people tend to do is they take their tape and start at the base of the tree and measure out a certain distance. So some clinometers are set up for giving you the height at 100 feet away, as you can see in this illustration. So the fellow with the blue line, he measured from the base of the tree out 100 feet. Now he's sighting up to what appears to be the highest point. That's number A, or letter A. And so as you can see, he's actually measuring to an imaginary point, B, and it's exaggerating the height. And this is unbelievably common. And sometimes trees are overestimated by tens of feet. So this is a problem. You can use triangulation, but what you have to do is follow the technique used by the guy with the red line. So what he's done is he's figured out where the highest point on the tree is. He's marked the spot on the ground directly beneath that, measured out 100 feet, and now he is sighting really past that false highest point to the highest point, which is C, and that gives an accurate estimate of the height. So on to the next slide. So the sign plus sign method is very accurate. Now you can use a clinometer and a rangefinder, and you get the angle with your clinometer, and you convert that degree of angle to the sign and multiply that by the distance, and that gives you the height. Then you do the same thing again to the base of the tree and add those two together, and it gives you the height of the tree. So here's a few instruments that can be used for the sign plus sign method that are going to give you good results. The 440 Pro staff made by Nikon, you have to use with a clinometer. And the rangefinder needs to be calibrated. And so by that, what I mean by that is that what you have to do is measure out, preferably with 2 or 3 100-foot tape measures, or you can do it in separate sections. But anyway, wherever that rangefinder clicks over, you actually get an exact distance of when it clicks over from one number to the next. And in many of the rangefinders, it's a 1 yard difference between the click over points. So you calibrate it so you know exactly how far your rangefinder is getting a reading. And so you write all those down, you have that chart with you so you can refer to it and get the exact distance. And that's a little bit time consuming, but it's pretty important if you're striving for accuracy. So the other two, the True Pulse 360 laser rangefinder will calculate the height for you, but it's not the best for shooting through brush. And this is kind of important because when you get to areas that aren't a manicured lawn, there's always twigs and branches and bushes and things in the way, other trees. And so with the True Pulse 200X laser rangefinder, that's listed at the bottom, it has a gate function which allows you to shoot through the brush to the target. So you can set it to the farthest point and it will go past all that other stuff to a point. It can't be too cluttered, but it really, really makes a difference. And it calculates the height for you. If you're using a tripod and you're using that True Pulse 200X laser rangefinder, you can get measurements that are accurate to within inches and even measure the same tree year after year and monitor its growth. So really pretty fascinating and interesting. Okay, now we're going to explore something here that's a common problem. When you see this silver maple tree, which was in Lyon County up in northwest Iowa, from this view, it looks like a huge tree. And it is a pretty big tree. However, if we look at it from another direction, you can see all of a sudden it doesn't look quite as big. Well, the reason is it's two trunks growing together and it's kind of pushing out. So from the other side, it appears to be bigger. So even though at first glance, this looks like a single trunk, it's not. So for the Big Tree program, it is designed to measure single trees, not clusters of trees. So oftentimes silver maples, cottonwoods, there's several species that are kind of notorious for sending up multiple leaders. And it really doesn't matter if it's one root system or several. If it's multiple trunks, you can't be including several trunks in one trunk measurement. Here's an example of a tree that at first glance looks very impressive. And in fact, this was actually a national champion for a while, but it's an imposter. I think it's obviously at least two trunks, but I'm pretty sure it was a three trunk tree. It was an impressive old silver maple or maples. And I enjoyed the experience of viewing it and climbing on it, but it really wasn't eligible for the way the program is designed. Now this one here, this is in Des Moines, and it's our current state champion silver maple. And I saw this years ago and I kind of passed it off as being a multi-trunk tree, but the gentleman in the photograph, he brought it to my attention again. And so I took a closer look, and as far as I can tell, I think it is a single trunk tree. So if you get a silver maple over 20 feet in circumference, that's a single trunk, that's exceptional. They are few and far between. And this map is going to give you the general location of the champion trees. As you can see, they're concentrated in about the eastern half of the state, with some clusters of champion trees in some of the bigger cities like Des Moines and Cedar Rapids and Iowa City and Davenport and Burlington. Now, of course, the derecho really took a hit on some of our champion trees, and you can see there were quite a few in Linn County. So there's still some assessing to be done there to see just what kind of shape they're in. But I know we lost at least two of those state champions in Linn County. In Scott County, Davenport had some damage too, so did Iowa City. Now, the hot spot for big trees in Iowa is down in southeast Iowa. If you look at Des Moines County, that's where Burlington is, you can see there's a whole bunch of little green dots there. And that is the big tree capital of Iowa. So you will be seeing some photographs coming up of trees from that part of the state. This one here is pretty interesting because I have a long history with it. So this is one of the first trees I ever measured. I may even have the information on those dimensions if I can run across them, but I know the circumference was something over 8 feet, but it was under 9 feet. And that was about 1973. So in 2018, you can see it's grown quite a bit. And the thing that's exciting about this tree is that it's a single trunk. So I had mentioned the cottonwoods and silver maples being notorious for having multi-trunks. So are mulberries. And if you think about their seeds or their fruit, it's full of little seeds. So it's not surprising that when they come up, there's often multiple trees there. Unfortunately, this tree did suffer some damage in the derecho, and there's also construction around it now. So I don't know what the outcome is going to be for this particular tree. But anyway, I really like this mulberry, even though they're rather invasive. In this particular situation, it just makes a beautiful specimen. This is a tree that I first measured in 1979, and the tree is still standing. So here's a picture of it actually taken in 1989. And that's what I looked like in 1989. And you can see it did pretty well in 10 years. It increased to over 1 foot in circumference. But this is what it looks like today. So in 2016, the circumference had ballooned up to 18 feet, 3 inches. So that's an increase of 5 feet. That's not too shabby. But notice how the height has not increased. And that's not uncommon. For a lot of trees, especially in the open, they reach a point where they pretty much top out and they just can't get much higher. And that's the case here. I'm getting the same height all those years apart, but look how the spread has increased. That can keep going as long as there's not, well, up to a point, and it all depends on storm damage. But it's an amazing tree. Here's another one that I've been monitoring for quite some time. It's American elm in Marshall County. And there's actually 2 of them. They're almost identical in size. And they're a little bit unusual because they key out to be American elms, but they have very large buds and twigs. And I think it's possible that they could be a hybrid between red elm and American elm, which might also explain why they've not succumbed to the Dutch elm disease, even though I've seen a lot of red elms die in recent years from Dutch elm disease. But pretty significant increase in trunk circumference. Again, the height's pretty static, and the spread has increased, but the spread would be greater, but it had considerable storm damage. Another shot of the same tree. It's got an impressive base on it with that root flare. And there's the former owner standing by the base. And this elm actually is in Windsor Heights. And the last time I saw it, it was healthy. And so a nice, impressive specimen. And this one stands in Sigourney. So I've got several of the elms. I just think they're one of the coolest trees, and they're among my favorites. It's just unfortunate that so few of the big ones survive. But check out the spread on this one. Average crown spread of 121 feet and a maximum spread of 131 feet. That's just awesome. And there's a close-up of the trunk. Just a wonderful tree. And speaking of wonderful, this is perhaps the largest American elm I have ever seen. I have found others that had bigger trunks, at least in circumference, but those were lower forking. So I think if you figured the volume in this tree, this one might be the winner of all of them. Unfortunately, this tree has died from Dutch elm disease, so that's disappointing. This ginkgo stands on the Cornell College campus up on high ground. So this was in the path of the derecho, and it did suffer quite a bit of damage, especially limbs on the south side of the tree. Many of those were broken off. So that's one that's going to require some attention as far as pruning, and then the spread dimension will need to be updated. Balsam fir, I really like balsam fir, and they're actually a conifer that is native to Iowa. There are several populations, small and isolated, in northeast Iowa, but the biggest ones you find are usually planted specimens, and this one's up at Lansing. Unfortunately, firs are prone to getting multiple leaders, and we're going to take another look at another fir with multiple leaders pretty soon. But if you look at this tree, about almost 2/3 of the way up, the tree forks. So it's got multiple leaders, and when that happens, and that's usually a result of some sort of damage, maybe the twig got chewed back or broken off, and so it responded by sending up multiple sprouts. So when that happens, at that juncture where those leaders started, it's a weak point in the tree, so they're prone to splitting. But those kinds of things usually don't get corrected, and eventually they will split. Interesting smooth bark on a balsam fir. And it's kind of cool in this cemetery. It's kind of on a good portion of it is sloping, sort of a north exposure slope. And so it's kind of a good environment for this northern tree. And it's done very well. Now, black maple, not everyone might be familiar with black maple, but it's actually closely related to a sugar maple. And so most people would call this a sugar maple or a hard maple, but technically it's a black maple. And this is one that I've monitored for many years. And it looks pretty good here, and it is quite impressive, especially that spread. However, on the other side of the tree would not be its photogenic side. There's a big gash where a large limb broke off, so the spread would have been even greater. European larches, I keep wanting to say this is one of my favorite trees. I guess I like a lot of them, but European larches are very cool. They're very graceful looking. This one is in Dubuque. It has been struck by lightning, and this happened quite a few years ago. So it's got a big wound on the other side of the trunk, and it is decaying pretty badly, but hopefully it'll stand for decades to come. Lightning is one of the biggest problems that trees face, especially tall trees. So Iowa is not the most conducive place to find big trees, but this is where I live, and so this is where I put in most of my work. And it's been enjoyable, but also disappointing because so many of the big trees do succumb to damage from storms and often cases lightning. This white spruce was in this amazing cemetery up in Winneshiek County that I found way back in 1981. The north and east sides of this cemetery were lined with big white spruces. Now, we see a lot of Norway spruces, we see quite a few blue spruces, but white spruces are not as common. So it was kind of unusual to find a cemetery that had so many and so many big ones. And this was the biggest of them all. Now, this is what the tree looked like in 2015. Almost all the other white spruces had been cut. They left this big one, and they left, I think, about 3 others. I'm not sure why they were cut, but these kinds of things are very disappointing. But anyway, look at the increase in the size of this tree. And the white spruce is not a particularly fast growing tree, but at last measurement, it was up to nearly 11 feet in circumference, and it was 95 feet tall, which is really quite incredible for an Iowa white spruce. Unfortunately, I have to report this is one that's no longer standing. I don't know if it was cut because there was no good reason, or if it was damaged by a storm or what, but it's gone. But there are 2 other spruces remaining, white spruces remaining in this cemetery, and they are the 2 biggest ones that we know of in Iowa, even though they're far smaller than this one. Now, we have had a few national champion trees in Iowa, but they are few and far between. This is one that we had in northeast Iowa near Pikes Peak State Park on private property. And there was enough interest in this tree that it was decided that we would inject it to try and prevent it from getting emerald ash borers. So a group of us went up there to do this a few years back, and we got there and discovered that the tree had snapped off in a storm. So if it wasn't the emerald ash borer, it was the storm. So again, disappointing, but at least we got it documented. So that part's kind of cool. So when we're talking about champion trees, whether they're state or national champions, they're not all big. This is the largest round leaf serviceberry that we know of in Iowa. And they're just a small species, but this is quite large for a round leaf serviceberry. Now, most of the serviceberries that we see, which are probably blooming right now, and if not, will be shortly, are the downy serviceberry. But this one is limited to little, very spotty distribution, so not one that most people are going to encounter. All right, this was one of my all-time favorite champion trees. Now, back in 1986, when I found this tree, I was going to go on a tree hunting trip, and I had my old Volkswagen Dasher, and I headed to eastern Iowa. I didn't know that the next day was the opening day of the deer shotgun season. So I was ready to get a motel, and there were no motel rooms to be found. Well, I drove and I drove, and I ended up in Bellevue. I just parked on the street and slept in my car. And overnight, there was about 6 inches of wet, heavy snow that fell. So I was cold all night, but I was still excited, and I continued north, kind of following the river for the most part, and I ended up in Claremont, and I found this Catholic cemetery, and it was one of the most amazing experiences I've ever had. It was full of huge white pines. They were awesome. This was the biggest one. And at that time, 1986, it was pretty impressive, with a circumference of over 11 feet and 95 feet tall for an open-grown white pine in Iowa. That's incredible. We see them a lot in cemeteries, but they usually top out at maybe 75 feet or something. This is what the tree looked like in 2012, and you can see how much it grew in that time, increased over 2 feet in trunk circumference. And look at the height, up to 118 feet. So I went there maybe 2016, anxious to update measurements. And when I got there, I found the tree was gone, along with 6 others on this far side of the cemetery. So I wrote a letter to the Catholic Church that was in charge of the cemetery, requesting information on why the tree had been cut, and if there was any part of the trunk that was left so we could get a cross section, and they never replied to me. So that answered my question for me, I think. It's my belief that this tree and the others were cut for the lumber, which I just didn't see happening I thought these trees would be safe in the cemetery, but that was not the case. Now, we do have some native white pines that are quite impressive. This is one of the tallest trees in Iowa. And this is in White Pine Hollow, which is, I would say White Pine Hollow and the Burlington area are my two favorite places in the state of Iowa. And it's because of the awesome trees that they have. And this one in White Pine Hollow, I've been monitoring for quite a while. And there are some of my tree hunting buddies with me there. That's Steve Cooper in the yellow sweatshirt, and he used to work at the Science Center where I worked. And he moved away, so I don't see him too much anymore. And then the fellow in the orange vest is Richard Miles. And he was a brilliant person, but unfortunately troubled as well. And he took his own life several years ago. So I lost those guys, and I especially miss Richard very much. And this tree here had a reign as the largest in Iowa. And if I had to pick one, I would say this is probably the most impressive white pine remaining in Iowa. Just awesome gradual taper on that trunk. It's just amazing. So who would think that we have something like this in Iowa? I was surprised. I didn't think we had anything this cool. But lo and behold, last year, I think it was in December, a friend of mine and I, we went up to check out a big cottonwood up by Sioux City, and we stumbled onto this cemetery and found this huge white pine, and it is the new state champion white pine. This is really an outlier. This is an anomaly. There shouldn't be a white pine that big in that part of the state. I have measured over 100 white pines, and all of the biggest ones have been in the eastern half of the state, and most of those really in the easternmost tier of counties. Awesome tree, just incredible. To have an open grown tree in western Iowa, a white pine, 118 feet tall, it's just crazy. There's a close-up of the trunk. I can't wait to get back and spend more time under the crown of this tree and admire it. Well, I had to use a wide angle on this hemlock, so it kind of scrunched it up. So it's actually quite a bit taller than that. But this is amazing. This is so much bigger than any other hemlocks in Iowa. It's growing in sandy soil, so I think it likes that. But now the lean that it has, that's true. That isn't distorted from the wide angle. And that's because it's up on a hill, and so it's subjected to strong south winds during the growing season, so it has a lean to it. But it's just an amazing tree. That's the owner in the red jacket, and then David Horst, who works at the Bickelhaupt Arboretum in Clinton. If anybody is familiar with butternuts, I hope they would be impressed with this tree. It's, I should say it was. This was in Lisbon, the Cedar Rapids area, and unfortunately the big storm last August took this tree out. Very disappointing, because this was just an amazing tree. I mean, a butternut with a spread, maximum spread of 116 feet. Never would have imagined that in Iowa. When I first found this tree, I was driving and I was looking back and forth to check out trees in people's yards. I literally did a double take. I glanced at that and looked away and looked back, and it's like, oh my gosh, that can't be a butternut, but it was, and it was huge. So thank goodness I did find it and get it measured and got it documented and got it photographed. So at least we have a record of it. It's just sad that we lost it. Okay, I promised you we'd go to Burlington, and this is a Burlington tree. There's some stiff competition for largest tulip tree, but this is probably my favorite, and I think it would be considered a co-champion now. There's another one in Davenport that's very big, and there's some others in Burlington that are pushing this one. But I don't know the status of the Davenport trees after the storm. So if you get to Burlington, just notice there's lots of big tulip trees and big pin oaks and many other species. It's just an incredible place if you love big trees. This one is one of the trees I'm most proud of. When I first found it, it was because the owner had told me about a big chinkapin oak on his property. And this is down in Lee County, close to the Mississippi River. So I went down there to check out the chinkapin oak, and the chinkapin oak was okay, but it was nothing really exceptional. But in the distance, I could see this tree, and I'm thinking to myself, what is that? And so he didn't know, and we walked over there, and I could tell it was an ash. And at first glance, I wasn't sure if it was a blue ash or a black ash, but either way, it was incredible. If it had been a black ash, it would have been a national champion, but it's a blue ash, and it's amazing. This is one of those trees, when you find it, you are certain it is the biggest one in the state. It's just that outstanding. In fact, even though the blue ash only gets into extreme southeast Iowa and is not very common, this is one of the largest blue ash in the country. Unfortunately, it has not been treated. The property is owned by a man and a woman. The man was willing to spend the money to get the tree treated, but his wife said no, so the tree has not been protected, which is unfortunate. I think in a case like this, we should try and preserve that tree. This impressive black oak stood in Iowa City, and you can see it's very close to the house and the garage. The owner of this tree loved the tree very much. When I said close, I mean close. It was actually touching the garage and pushing the wall and foundation of that garage in. And even after a large limb broke off of this tree and broke through the roof of this house and went through the ceiling of the owner's bedroom and nearly crushed the owner's wife, he still kept the tree. But it had a fungus problem and it had to be taken down. So this is one of the ones that I really miss because it was just such an amazing specimen. Okay, this is our only current national champion tree in Iowa. And it's not a native tree, but certain trees like the European alder are in this country reproducing on their own, so they're considered naturalized and they are eligible for the national list. Now this is in Davenport, so this is one we need to check the status of after the storm to see if it's still intact. There's actually hundreds of European alders in that park in Davenport, so pretty cool place. American beech, one of my favorite trees. They're just amazing. They're not native to Iowa. They will grow here, but they have some particular requirements. Oftentimes the site to get them started is a little bit too hot and sunny, but once they get established, they can do well. I don't know if you can see me standing by the bigger one there. I'm kind of blending in, but very big tree. So recently I was looking at Google Earth and I was checking on them and they're not there. They're both gone. In fact, since I started measuring big trees, we have lost, I believe, the largest 9 beech trees, American beech trees in Iowa. They're all gone. So keep your eyes open. Maybe you can find a big one. That would be great. And this is a big cottonwood in Clinton County. It was the state champion for many years. Now the cottonwood is one of those that often has a multi-trunk, and so a big one like this with a single trunk is quite rare. This is actually an imposter. So at first glance, this looks like a huge cottonwood tree. And you can see a man standing by the base on the right-hand side, which illustrates just how big that trunk is. However, that limb or trunk on the left-hand side is actually a separate trunk. And so it doesn't qualify as a single trunk, so we can't really include it. So that's why my measurements are approximate. I kind of lost interest once I figured out it wasn't a single trunk tree. But this one is a single trunk tree, perhaps the most impressive cottonwood that I've ever found in Iowa. This was in western Iowa, Monona County. What I like about it is the way it maintains that single trunk for so far, and it's so big. So perhaps the most volume of any cottonwood that I've seen in Iowa. Now we're down to Henry County. This is in Mount Pleasant. This is the state champion pecan. Just an amazing tree. I mean, look at those dimensions, nearly 14 feet in circumference and approximately 100 feet high and 100-foot spread. Just an incredible tree. So pecans do grow in Iowa. They will grow in the Des Moines area. You get far enough north, you may not get a nut crop, but they should grow in central Iowa. Sycamores have the potential to get very large. This is our state champion, and it's in Geode State Park. I've been watching this tree for quite a while. It's as impressive as it is, over 100 feet tall. The top of it blew out many years ago, so the height would have been greater. And that's not uncommon. The spread also would have been much greater than that. Our state champion white oak, and this is just outside of Burlington. It's kind of an atypical tree. It doesn't really have typical white oak form. Almost looks more like an elm, the way all the branches kind of come out at one point and has kind of a vase shape. But it's a white oak. Unfortunately, I don't think it's in the best shape. I think it is succumbing to tatters, and tatters is a problem that affects that oak trees are very susceptible to, and it's from herbicide drift. So that is a big problem here in Iowa. Pin oaks grow fast, not terribly long-lived, but they can get quite large. And this is our largest one. This is in Davenport, another tree that we really need to find out if it was damaged in that storm. It's a beautiful tree. I mean, it's a small backyard where this tree stands. So much of the crown goes over neighbors' yards. And there's a shot of the trunk. Sassafras, typically a southern tree. They're not native to Iowa, but they come up almost to Lee County in southeast Iowa, but they don't quite make it to Iowa. This one grows in Montrose, which is in Lee County, and it's had some very poor pruning, so that's going to shorten its life, and that was unfortunate. Also has cost it some size, but the trunk is amazing, and I think it would stand out as a large sassafras anywhere within their range. State champion walnut at the University of Iowa. Just an amazing tree. You can see there's a dark line going up the trunk. That is a wound from a previous lightning strike. The tree did have a lightning protection system installed. Then something happened, and I don't think it was really hooked up to be working properly. But a few years ago, another lightning protection system was installed in the tree. So it should be safe from lightning strikes. And I understand that it fared pretty well during the August derecho from last year. And this American elm is also at the University of Iowa. It has been the state champion, and right now with that species, things are kind of in limbo because they're so close. I need to get some exact measurements to figure out which one is actually the champion. But with the loss of that bigger one that we looked at earlier, this very well may be the state champion again. Big honey locust, and this is near Iowa City. Green ash, an abundant tree, or at least they were before the emerald ash borer. This is in Grinnell, and it's interesting because Grinnell is a town that, you know, I've looked at pretty thoroughly, but for some reason I hadn't come down this particular street, and a few years ago I did, and I saw these big ash trees. And the two in the foreground here are almost identical in size. Now, the second one back had quite a bit of decay on its trunk, and so that one understandably had to be removed. The other one was in great shape, and it was my understanding that it was going to be treated for emerald ash borer. But recently I found out the tree is dead, so I don't know if it was treated and they didn't follow through with subsequent treatments, or if it never got treated. But anyway, that is unfortunate because there will never be another green ash like that. Believe me, I've been looking for 50 years, and that's the most impressive one I've ever seen. All right, white fir. White firs are really cool trees. They're beautiful. The needles are soft. They're just a really cool tree. However, like the balsam fir, white firs are prone to having multiple leaders. So what happens is at some point that main trunk gets damaged, and they will send up multiple leaders in response to that. So this one was a state champion for a while. This tree stood in Adel, Iowa. And I told the owner that it was going to be prone to splitting, and this is what happened. And when I talked to him after this happened, he admitted that he was listening to me, but he was thinking to himself, yeah, right. He didn't think it would split, but I knew better, but I didn't convince him. Now, unfortunately, it was the larger leader that broke off. It was on the north side of the tree. Well, it was a strong south wind that broke that off. Well, now this other leader does not have the protection from winds out of the north. And here's what happened to the tree. So if you have a fir, it's very important when it's young to train it to have one leader. Otherwise, you're going to end up with a tree like this. This white fir was a state champion for a while, and this one's in Jefferson. It doesn't look like this any longer. It's had quite a bit of damage, but it was a large, impressive tree, but it too had a double leader, and one of those leaders broke off, but it left a stub. So in my younger crazy days, I volunteered to clean that up. So I spent quite a bit of time in that tree working on it. So I cut back that stub from that one leader, and then I thinned out the branches on the remaining leader to reduce the chance of it breaking off from the wind, so it wouldn't be so much like a sail and the wind would pass through it. So I don't know if I would do that today, but in my younger days, that's the kind of thing I used to do. So I'm up there working towards the top of the tree and getting a good view of the town of Jefferson. This is the largest white fir in Iowa, and I've been monitoring this tree since 1978. So look at the growth that's happened to this tree in that time. Pretty remarkable. Unfortunately, this tree stands on private property, and the owners are unwilling to cooperate in the Big Tree program. So our largest white fir is not our champion, and that's unfortunate. It's quite disappointing, especially since it's a tree that I've been monitoring for so long. I don't have a photograph of our current champion white fir. I found it fairly recently. There's actually two that'll probably be co-champs, and they're both in Atlantic, Iowa. But they don't compare to this one. Okay, we're in central Iowa. This is Indianola, I guess south central Iowa. And this is a former state champion white pine. And I have found several others since this first state champion white pine in 1979 that were a little bigger. This one still stands. The main thing about this one is the trunk. It's got a huge trunk, approximately 5 feet in diameter. Now you can see the height did grow some, the spread not so much. The spread was much greater, but it suffered a lot of storm damage and lost some big limbs. And it also has a large strip of bark missing on the other side of the tree. When I'm taking pictures of the trees for something like this, I'm focusing on their better side, so that's why I don't have a picture of that. But there's considerable decay, and so I don't know what the outcome of this tree is going to be, except I know it's not going to be good. It's just I don't know how long the tree will still be standing. So that is a huge trunk for a white pine. And this is a tree. This is one of those trees when you find it and you say, this has got to be the biggest one in Iowa. And I have no doubt that it was, because this tree has been gone for many years and I have not found anything else close to it. Recently, I found a hackberry in Burlington. I still have to get measurements on it, and it will likely have a trunk over 15 feet in circumference, and that's very exciting, but this one was so much bigger. This one actually was destroyed by a tornado. So, you know, storms are a huge problem for huge trees. Catalpas, if you're a tree lover, you probably like catalpas. If you're not a tree lover and you have one in your yard, you probably hate it because they are kind of messy. You get lots of flowers, you get lots of seed pods, lots of leaves, but I like them. I think they're beautiful. This one's in Woodland Cemetery in Des Moines, and it's right up there. We've got several big catalpas that have been vying for the biggest, and this one has been state champion in the past and possibly again in the future, depending on what happens to other trees. Isn't that something? When you get a catalpa that's in full bloom, it's amazing, but it's kind of hard to capture. To get the exposure right on the flowers and everything else. So if you look close, you can see I'm standing by the base on the left-hand side. Now, late breaking news. I just found this tree a couple of weeks ago in southern Iowa in Allerton. And believe it or not, it's over 20 feet in circumference. Now the rest of the tree is not that impressive. It's not very tall. The spread is just kind of, you know, nothing amazing, but the trunk is amazing. So it is our new state champion Catalpa tree. And I put this in here because this is a relatively recent find. This is a rock elm. Now here in central Iowa, it's not a tree that we would encounter very often. I don't recall ever seeing one in central Iowa, but they become a little more numerous in northeast Iowa, and this is in Yellow River Forest. And Bruce Blair, who works for the DNR, is the one who told me about an area that had rock elms to look in. And so I found this one, which was the largest one of those trees. So I have Bruce Blair to thank for this new champion rock elm. And speaking of Bruce Blair, there he is. And this is a rather amazing place. First of all, let me say that if you look at tree field guides and you look at the range map for the red maple, you'll see that they are in Minnesota, they're in Wisconsin, they're in Illinois, and they're in Missouri. But nothing shows up in Iowa. Well, that may change because of this tree and several others in the vicinity, and they are red maples, appear to be naturally occurring. The only thing is it's, not that big of a deal. We would expect to find them, but for some reason there hasn't been any. So, but in future field guides, there may be a little dot in Iowa. And so that's kind of cool. Not a particularly large trunk, but quite tall. Now, this tree, this swamp white oak from Story County, it's just a beautiful tree. I actually had photographs of it when the person standing under it, you can see there's a large stub above him. That is a relatively recent limb that was lost. And I already had photographs of this tree in the summer and it looked symmetrical and it was beautiful. But I had someone helping me save my photographs and something happened and I lost that. So by the time I went back to get more photographs, that big limb had broken off. And so now the tree was no longer symmetrical. Still has lots of character though, and it's still an amazing photograph. But this tree was right in the path of the bad storm last August. And unfortunately, this tree is now gone. So this was one of the ones that I really, really hated to find out that it had been lost. Oh, I mentioned there was an interesting story associated with this tree. So the owner proceeded to tell me that many decades ago, there were lots of swamp white oaks in this area. So the owner at that time wanted to remove them to clear it out for cropland, and they were using dynamite to blow up the trees to get rid of them. Well, they came to this tree, and because it was so big, they decided it would take too much dynamite, so they decided to leave it. So that was the only reason that that tree was spared, which it's a cool story, but it's unfortunate. It's actually pretty typical of what's happened to so many of Iowa's biggest trees. All right, well, that concludes the photograph portion of the program, and this gives you a little more information if you want to find out a little more about the Big Tree Program. You can check out that website through the DNR. You can contact me, mrao@mchsi.com, and that's actually all lowercase. There's my phone number. You could also contact Emma Hannigan at the DNR if you wanted to find out about a particular tree, get a little more information about it. Or you could contact Mark Runkle at Trees Forever, and he could help you out. Just keep in mind that many of our trees are on private property, so a lot of owners are a little bit, have some reservations about cooperating with the program. So we want to make sure we keep them happy. So if there's a tree on private land, you must get permission first before you approach the tree. So I believe that pretty well covers the program. So thank you very much for joining.
Thank you, Mark. That was an absolutely fascinating presentation. The pictures were great. Really want to thank you for presenting there. So let's get to some questions that folks might have. Let's see here. We're just going to start at the very top. And Mark, some folks want to know, what is the name of the cemetery where the white spruces are located? If you're willing to share, and if not, that's fine.
I believe it's a Prairie Lutheran Cemetery, and that is, I'm trying to think of the number of the highway, but it's the highway that goes southwest from Decorah, I believe. So it's just a few miles from Decorah, on the east side of the highway.
Excellent, thank you. And another follow-up question here, Mark. So how would you approach private property owners to look at their trees? Do you have any tips or pointers?
Well, I'm actually looking for tips and pointers because I don't know what the best method is. I guess what I usually do when I'm trying to figure out who the owner of a property is, I just go through the GIS for the county and figure out who the owner is. And it's harder to use phone numbers than it used to be, but I usually send a letter that explains what I'm doing. But if a person was really interested in seeing a tree, they could contact myself or Emma and possibly get a phone number for that landowner, and then they could give them a call. I guess that would be probably my recommendation for the easiest and first choice on that particular request.
Very good, very good. Let's see here. Oh, so Susan wants to know, what are the responsibilities or costs for the landowner regarding participation in the Big Tree program?
Well, it's strictly up to them. So they can choose to spend a lot of money and try and take care of that tree, or they can choose to do nothing. The only thing that they're required to do is to cooperate, to have the tree measured and included in the register. So you get lots of different approaches to the owner's trees, and some of the owners love their trees, and others are just kind of, the tree is just there and they never really paid much attention to it. Oftentimes they don't even know what species it is. But the biggest factor is that maybe there's some corrective pruning or a lightning protection system that would be very advantageous. The cost is usually prohibitive. So in most cases, nothing really is done, but sometimes I'll make suggestions of what they could do.
Great. So here's a question about, what might the age be for the white oak in your last slide?
Oh, that swamp white oak. Boy, that's hard to say. Now, there are formulas. You can go online and get formulas to determine the age of the trees, and quite frankly, I say I don't have much trust that those are accurate at all, because there's just so many variables. Now, that swamp white oak was growing really fast. When I would update the trunk circumference, it was really adding on the girth. So it may not be as old as it would appear, but I would say that tree, I would say a minimum of probably 200 years, and it could be considerably more.
Excellent. So here somebody wants to know the white pine in Woodbury County. Is that one that can be shared?
Well, I believe the name of the cemetery is Logan Park Cemetery.
Logan Park.
Yes, and it's kind of at the north side of Sioux City. I don't know if it's within the city limits or not, but yeah, it's a cemetery, and anybody could drive up there and take a look at the tree, and I hope they do. It's an amazing tree.
Excellent, excellent. So Andy wants to know, great talk, by the way, but are you compensated in any way for doing this? He imagines a lot of miles on the car.
Well, for most of the time I've been doing this, there was no compensation. The last couple of years, the Iowa Arborist Association has been giving a contribution to the cause, which I appreciate very much. It's not a huge amount, but it is very welcome. So there is a way to donate to the Big Tree Program. If you go online, and if you can't find it, just contact Emma Hannigan with the DNR. And if you wanted to make a contribution to the Big Tree Program, that would be wonderful. Because there's currently no funding through the state, and the program is at a standstill essentially, except for me keeping it going and contributions from a few other people.
And it's a small world here because Virginia, who asked about where that place was in Woodbury County, says she might have ancestors there. So fantastic. Go visit the ancestors and visit that lovely tree. So yeah. Oh, so someone wants to know here, Mark. Okay, let me pull it up. Mark, you measured a black oak maybe in Gladbrook, Tama County this year. Any information on oldest, tallest, largest in Iowa? Was just curious if there was any estimation for that.
Black oaks. I'm hard pressed to think of one in Tama County that stands out. However,
Mark, typing. It was a black maple. Black maple.
Oh, the black maple. Yeah, that's in Union, and that may be Hardin County. I'm not sure, but that tree was probably planted. Now, for a lot of the trees that are in people's yards, if you go back and find out when that house was built, that is oftentimes going to approximate the age of the tree. And if trees were planted right away after the house was built, you may be able to add a few years because they probably didn't put in something that was just 6 inches tall.
Got it. Excellent, excellent. Well, let's. I don't see any other questions. If there are any, oh, here's someone says, Mark, you need to write a book. Such great stories. Andy wants to send that along. And Susan says, fascinating presentation. And yes, the technology works. So incidentally, if you're still with us, this is recorded. I can go back and clean it up and make it a nice polished so that we can forget that first 10 minutes ever happened. And we will post this then, and you'll get an email on how you can access it for further viewing. So absolutely, definitely. With that, Mark, I really want to thank you so much. I knew this was going to be an interesting topic. Like I said, we had over 100 folks register, and I think that they were very well served in hearing all the stories that you had to tell about Iowa's largest and tallest trees. We hope you can come back and join us sometime as you discover more largest and tallest trees.
Well, thank you. It is kind of an ongoing project, as you know, and so some of the biggest, oldest trees are quite old, and sometimes they come down, so it will be changing. So I'll look forward to doing it again sometime.
Thanks much, Mark. Everyone have a great day. Enjoy the rest of the week.